Hey, welcome to day 67 as we dig into the most complex system in your entire body, besides the endocrine system. That would be the immune system. If we look at this, our primary goal is to go after the difference between the processes of primary and secondary immune responses, which is perfect for our COVID vacation, and to get an idea of how all those wonderful parts work together like a giant Rube Goldberg. Now, key things we should notice for day 66 and 67, they're tied together. You are working ahead to get your endocrine as well as some nervous stuff done. And that's what the GRs are about. And there's 2014 FRQ, which we'll be going after on the 28th is when we did it as class. So we've already done it for most of you. Anyways, so if we look at this, normally I'd be wishing you happy Earth Day because I'm doing it this week and you're going to watch it next week. So hopefully take care of this baby because it's going to take care of my babies, right? Now, if you go outside these days, you will notice that there are flowers everywhere. And all those flowers, of course, oh, they smell so good. And then you're spraying mucus everywhere. I sprayed some on my screen. That's because these lovely things called seasonal allergies, if you're like me and you get to enjoy them. You should notice that that's weird that plant pollen would make you sneeze and be all clogged in your head and mucus dripping everywhere. But that's because your immune system is easy to fool. It's a complex system that's easy to goof up on. And one of the, side effects of that is if it doesn't kill you, then it's good enough for natural selection. So we get to live with those things. So we'll take a look into that today. I'll get rid of my big ugly head. And as we dig into this, our primary goal is to figure out how the vaccine work in conjunction with your immune system. And then why are things like AIDS so hard for our immune system to beat? Because they take quite a toll on us and other species with their own versions of HIV. Cool. Write down the questions. Take a swing at it. You're going to want to give yourself lots of space because this is a seriously complex story. But it's one of my favorites. Cool. Here we go. If we look at a vaccine, the vaccine, of course, is kind of this strange idea that when Jenner came up with in the first idea from looking at cowpox. And cowpox vaccinia was caused by a virus. So when we get a vaccine, we actually inject our bodies with a virus. And we should notice by now that a virus is made of some kind of nucleic acid, either RNA or DNA. And it's surrounded by this lovely protein coat that is its capsule. And that has on it these keys. And these keys, of course, are called the antigens. And that's crucial because they're anti your production. They're antigens to you. As this antigen invader is coming in, you don't want it to kill you. So what we do is we figure out that we can attenuate it, which means we weaken it. We damage some part of it. And typically what they damage is they damage the nucleic acid part of it so that it actually can't take over your cells. And you only want to damage the inside because basically your cells want to practice on the outside, the antigen. And remember, these antigens are their keys. These are the protein-based keys that they're going to use to unlock your cells. So if you keep it in mind that the antigens are the keys, you want them intact so that you can recognize them. They also act as an ID badge for the virus. Whatever shows up, it's the mug shot to grab it. There's lots of analogies for it. Now, as you inject this vaccine into your body, it's going to go into what it naturally would do, and that's what it does automatically. That's the innate response known as primary immunity. And primary immune response is innate, meaning it came with nativity. You were born with it. That's the first thing that's kicked in. So you inject this vaccine into you, and who notices it? Well, there's these really cool things called big eaters. They're known as macrophages, right? The big engulfers. These macrophages look like amoebas because they function a lot like our ancestor, an amoeba-like creature in slime molds. And those macrophages come in, and when they notice that there's something that doesn't belong, they tend to attach to it with protein receptors on their surface. Now, what these are is they're called toll-like receptors because they're paying a toll. This is basically an ID checker. It's checking badges as it goes through the cell. Hey, you belong, you don't belong, I'm going to attack you and kill you. So what it's going to do, of course, is if it doesn't belong, it's going to grab onto that antigen and it's going to go through phagocytosis, put it in a vesicle, and try to eat it, which is awesome. As it's doing that, it wants to tell others in your body, since you're multicellular, hey, we got an invader here. So it actually starts sending out messages, and these messages go through the bloodstream. These are called interleukins. So it releases interleukins, and that makes sense because it's between other leukocytes, and leuka means white. So these are, of course, if you think of leukemia, it's talking to other white blood cells, which are the biggest component of your immune system, right? So that sends it out in the blood, sends it all over the body to say, hey, there's an invader. Quick, we need help. As it's doing that, it also does a fascinating thing. It's ripping apart the virus and it rips off specifically the antigens, the keys. And what it does is it takes them and it goes into a presenting mode where it sticks those out. And it's saying, hey, we were invaded. This is what the invader looks like. Here's the mugshot of what they look like, right? If you see somebody like this, get on them, right? And who is listening to this? Well, it's other leukocytes, specifically a group that are very, very helpful. They're called helper T cells. And helper T cells are great because one of the things that they have is they were receiving these interleukins, which is why they started migrating towards that part of the body. But they have on top of them these things called MHCs. And MHCs stand for major histocompatibility complexes. If we look at that, they're major because they're big, but they're histo because that refers to your tissues, and compatibility because it's wondering whether or not it belongs in your body, and it's complex because it's a bunch of proteins put together. If it latches on to this antigen that's being presented, it now basically takes another mugshot of it and starts to form a memory of what the shape of that looks like. Now, the cool thing about helper T cells is I always remember what they are is they're teller cells, right? Their job is to tell other cells what this invader looks like and to send out messages that there is an invader. So they send out other messages, and these messages are called cytokines. If you remember, cyto means cell, kine refers to kinetics. This gets cells moving to help you to fix this problem. It's recruiting other immune cells to do it. Now, they're not called T cells because they're teller cells, but I always remember them that way. They're called T cells because they are developed and produced in the thymus gland, the gland that sits just above your heart, and that's why they get their T cell name. Now, these helper T cells, they take and they copy that antigen, and they continue to present it out. They're saying, hey, here's the invader, here's what it looks like, and the cytokines go through your bloodstream and recruit these cool things with the best name ever called cytotoxic T cells. And cytotoxic T cells, as their name suggests, are cell-killing T cells. They kill cells. So I always remember that these T cells are not tellers alone. They are terminators. Yeah, the terminators. Hasta la vista. Or they are also tellers as well, because T cells are good at sending out more and more of those cytokines, because they want to do more recruiting after this. They have on their surface, of course, major histocompatibility complexes that are then going to read that badge and say, okay, this is what the invader looks like, so I'm going to go out into the body and see if I find any cells that have run into this guy. So they migrate out from there once they've picked up what the antigen looks like. That's why this is what's called a cell-mediated response, because there are cells actively doing the work here, mediating your response to it. Kind of makes sense. In addition to that, we've got other things that are going on. One of the things you'll notice, even when you get a vaccine, is you get a lot of different side effects. One of them can be pus or mucus building up. Those are natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are a lot like macrophages. They're not picky about what they eat. They'll just move out there. That's why the doctor's looking in your throat to see if you have white clumps in your adenoids. And you're going, it's because they're looking for pussy secretions where these natural killer cells have kicked into extra production because they were looking for invaders. In addition to that, you, of course, start to feel miserable because your body, these interleukins cause your body to actually increase your body temperature. You start to develop a fever, and that's because you're making the fever to try to cook the bacon of the keys. If you can cook their keys, then, of course, you can prevent them from sneaking into your cells as well. The tricky part is if the fever gets too high, then you might actually denature the doors too, because everything in your body is made out of bacon. It's made out of protein that does a function for you, right? Along with these, you start getting a lot of mucus production. You start getting mucus coming out of your ears, your nose, it's dripping out of your eyes, you're starting to phlegm up and cough. Part of that mucus, of course, is just you excreting fluid because you're trying to wash all the areas of your body where viruses might infect, your mucous membranes, to slide those things down. It makes you feel miserable, but it does a pretty good job of washing them down your throat into an acid bath called your stomach, or running them out of your nose to get away from you. And some viruses exploit that to make sure that they can get to their next host, hence all the sneezing with things like coronavirus. Now, in addition to that, you, of course, start to feel really, really warm, and you get a lot of swelling in your limbs, and you feel grumpy. That's because your body is releasing histamine from things called mast cells. What that does, of course, is that causes vasodilation. That vasodilation is why you feel extra heat as the fever can spread throughout your body with the warm blood flowing it. And that's creating the highway for things like helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells to pick up on the interleukins and cytokines to notice what's going on. So increased blood flow. And that, of course, is being released by these lovely mast cells. And if you have allergies, you love your mast cells, right? All that's going on at the same time as we're signaling these helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells that, hey, here's the invader, go after them. And the cytotoxics are cell mediated. So what they're going to do is they're going to go out and they're going to look for cells. And some of the cells in your body, like in your ears, your nose, your throat, where you got that sore throat, they're infected cells. And these infected cells do a pretty elegant thing for the rest of the cells there. As they're in the middle of dying and the virus is taking over their machinery, they actually take and they rip off part of the virus that invade it and they present it on the surface of their cells. And they say, hey, this is the thing. This is the invader that tried to kill me. This is what they look like. Please get them before they get everybody else. The great thing about this is the cytotoxic T cells have a receptor that fits it perfectly now because they've been communicating, so to speak, with the helper T cells. If they latch onto a cell that's presenting that it's been infected, it then kicks into the mode and it actually recruits these things called perforins. And the perforins are a bunch of proteins that come together in a complex. And what they do is they perforate. They punch holes inside the infected cell, and then, of course, fluid that's abundant outside will flow into them. You basically make a leaky cell. As it flows in from high to low, it causes the cell to swell until eventually, boom, the cell lyses. And as it lyses, it explodes. Now, the great thing about it exploding is, you might be like, hey, there's a virus copying inside of it. Couldn't that be a problem? The virus components that didn't get fully made together, they're not functional yet. And what this creates is this complementary system of these perforins where now I have a whole bunch of inactive viruses that didn't fully form that get shot out of the cell, and I get a whole bunch of cell fragments. And you can tell that this happens because this is when you get that sore throat. It's sore because you're actually blowing up your throat cells on purpose, and it's creating a whole bunch of mucus to trap all that virus chunks and the cells to try to wash those things away. Now, the great thing is with a non-functional, you still don't want them in your body just in case they might be functional. So more big eaters, more macrophages make their way in. If you had strep throat, you know that these macrophages are making their way in and they're eating those things up. It's eating up your cell parts, hence the sore throat, as well as the mucus. And that's why the mucus has got some white and green components, because that, of course, is part of your immune system cells coming in. They're not all. Neutrophils have a greenish color as well. Now, all of that is trying to save you from whatever invades you, so you're born with that. You don't have to learn anything to do it. You have the fever automatically. Your cytotoxic C cells do a little bit of learning off the other ones, but really they're just going out there. The macrophages aren't picky. They just eat whatever doesn't belong. That takes time, though, and it creates a lot of misery in your life because you got to experience the fever and the aches and the chills and all that painful swelling. So your body doesn't want to experience this again, which is why it kicks in and starts developing this thing called secondary immunity. Makes sense. Primary school, you learn the easy stuff the first time. Secondary, you have to acquire it. And the way that you acquire it is through learning. And the best way to learn that, of course, is to build some memory of it, pun intended, right? Now, if we look at this, that's why at the same time that the helper T cells are recruiting cytotoxics, they're also presenting those antigens and their shape to another type of cell called B cells. And the B cells, I remember, are like Bob, they're the builders. Right? And they're not called B cells because they're builders, but it's good to remember that they build things. They will recognize the antigens there with their MHCs, and they're found in the bone marrow, hence the B cell part of this. And they really can divide and become many cells, but the two most important cells that become is now they're going to recognize this mugshot of this invader that you've been invaded with before, and they're going to create these things called memory cells. The cool thing about the memory cells is they could possibly last your entire life, and they replicate and build receptor proteins that perfectly fit with the antigens of that invader. At least they get better and better each time you're exposed to it. These are the memory B cells. These are going to hang out in places like your adenoids, these are lymph glands, and they're going to migrate throughout your body. And if you're really, really healthy, you can keep track of them. But the number of them that you make depends on how healthy you are and how well you were exposed to them, right? More exposure, more memory cells. That's why we have to get boosters with our vaccines to make sure that we have memory cells that are there. If you're not healthy in your lifestyle, those memory cells die off, and then you got to learn again the hard way, right? At the same time, the B cells also can divide off and become these things called plasma cells. And plasma cells are doing the main building piece of this. What they're making is they're making antibodies. Antibodies, of course, is what your body produces to go against the bodies that invade you. Antibodies attack the antigens. And basically what they are is they're protein key covers. I like things like duct tape or Play-Doh that goes over the key, and their job is to clog up the keys. What they're doing is fitting perfectly over those antigens so that as a virus is moving in, say you have the a real virus show up, now those antibodies will latch onto it, block its keys, and now it can't sneak into your cells. This is why it's not so funny. It's bloody, and it's called a humoral immunity. Humoral immunity, of course, is coming from the fact that humors were the body fluids, and this is not a cell doing it, so it's not cell mediated. It's the antibodies that are carried inside of it. And anytime you've been exposed to an antigen, if it's a good exposure, your body will produce these antibodies, which is why we can detect whether or not you've been invaded by something like the coronavirus. Hopefully, as they get better at this, they detect the antibodies, which means that, hey, you've had this mugshot before, you've seen this guy, okay, you've gone through the experience of this, you've developed secondary immunity. Now, the key thing of this is, as those antibodies show up, let's say the real virus shows up in your body, you get exposed to it after your vaccine, then, of course, these can clump viruses together, and we get this process called opsonization. And in opsonization, the clumping of them allows them to collect together and make it easier for macrophages to swallow them. Now, because the antibodies are there and you already know how to build them, that means that you can skip a lot of the steps and go straight to producing the antibodies. And that's why your secondary immunity response can be much, much faster, and you don't have to experience things like chickenpox a second time or a certain strain of influenza a second time, because you've already learned how to recognize it. The only problem with that is the viruses also mutate, and they change their keys, and they try to work their way around. So we always have to do that. And one of the trickiest viruses for humans to conquer right now has to do with this thing called the AIDS virus, and the HIV virus that causes AIDS, the disease. And that's because, of course, HIV does a very crucial thing. It attacks the most important cells that connect all of the other cells, and that would be the helper T cells. It goes after and basically attacks the dispatch officer at your police force. And when it goes into there, it invades them and it stops them from telling all the other cells, hey, go off and kill this guy, or hey, build these antibodies, which means the rest of the body doesn't know that a 911 call is going out. And that's why people tend to die of pneumonia or smaller infections or hepatitis that would cause problems in their body but wouldn't necessarily kill them rapidly. That's because it's basically the HIV has targeted their T cells, which are doing most of the telling. So hopefully you recognize that T cells, the tellers and the terminators, are part of that cell-mediated response that's primary and innate. You're born with it, right, along with the fever. That, of course, will kick in every single time, but you also are hopefully developing secondary immunity where those T cells tell the B cells to build antibodies and memory cells. So if you run into that antigen again, you're ready to beat it much, much faster. Now, the good news is you can look at the PowerPoint slide that I've animated for you that goes through all those steps if you can't read this part of it. But the basic idea is practice on a vaccine is like playing basketball against a preschooler. You can beat them every single time because they didn't have a chance. It's fun. That would be, of course, a better experience than running into an NBA player, the real virus, and trying to practice while they're destroying you and doing lots of, alley-oops and stuff. That's why vaccines are so handy. And as we look at the coronavirus, they're trying to develop a vaccine that's good enough to give us practice so that we don't have to go through primary immunity and possibly get killed in that process, so we can automatically kick into secondary immunity. And each time you're exposed to it, you get better and better at building more memory cells and building antibodies that actually fit better. That's why boosters work into that, which we normally cover in all our presentations. Then, of course, there's the natural-born killer cells, or the natural killer cells. These guys are the macrophages. They're the big eaters. If you don't know what it is, eat it and then tell everybody there's an invader, right? Now, normally we would go into detailed presentations where we have wonderful conversations and space out in terms of the space of clarifying questions. And we talk about measles, we talk about snake bites, we talk about breast milk. It would be great. Even jellyfish and peeing on your legs. Instead, this year we don't get to do that, so maybe next year for the other kids. Hey, but I did want to hit some of them. Why do people get allergies? How does allergy medicine work? One of the things we should notice, of course, is allergies are linked with a thing called IgEs, and we'll see that a lot. They're called immunoglobulin E's. These are, of course, antibodies that are specifically targeting large invaders of our ancestors, things like worms or slugs or ticks, where they actually hook into your histamine cells and cause them to release tons of histamine, which causes all the swelling and the sneezing and the pain because they're trying to flush out large parasites like worms from your nose or your ear, which were common for our ancestors. Unfortunately, the more times you're exposed to anything that's an invader, your body can mistakenly make these IgE antibodies, the E antibodies, and overproduce the amount of those and make your histamine overproductive in terms of your mast cells overreactive to them. So if you've been exposed to, say, grass your entire life in one part of the world, well, that grass now unfortunately triggers an immune response to wash away a parasite that doesn't kill you. It just makes your life miserable, and that's good enough for evolution. Now, the way we combat this, of course, is we use these things called antihistamines. And what the antihistamines basically do is they block the reception sites so that histamine can't cause the mast cells to do it, and then you don't get all the inflammation and pain and stuff. But they do make you drowsy because they go into other receptors that make you tired too. Now, other parts we can notice, this is a good buddy of mine. He was getting an allergy test, and you can see that he had lots of histamine reactions because he's allergic to pretty much everything, hence all the sneezing. That is because those mast cells are releasing the histamine. And why do they do that? Basically, what it does is a vasodilator. As it releases the histamine from an invader, like something like a splinter or the needle prick that brought in those different allergens, the body notices that the mast cells release the histamine, which causes the vessels to swell up the capillaries, because then you can move more of the macrophages in, and that's why pus develops underneath the wound. It's eating possible bacteria or viruses that might have infected the area, and you got to have that swelling to save yourself, right? Now, other things that we should notice is there is natural immunity where you get infected with something like mumps, measles, or rubella, or chickenpox, or you can acquire it through a vaccine where you get to practice and nobody gets chickenpox anymore in America. Or you can, of course, steal antibodies from your mom, and those antibodies you borrow from her milk. There's a lot of immunoglobulin B and immunoglobulin A that are involved with that. That's why natural birth is so important, and breastfeeding. And then those are both a lot like stabbing a horse with snake venom and stealing the antibodies from that, so you borrow its antibodies. The only problem with stealing antibodies from something like a horse for snake bite antivenom is then it's a foreign protein. And the second time you put it in, your body goes, hey, I've seen that invader again or before. Let's mount an immune response, and you can have a hyper response to it, right? So you can see that mother's milk is actually like borrowing antibodies, just like snake venom. But maybe that's why us mammals did so well. We were arming our babies with an anti-venom. Hey, antibodies. Now, massively complex. Hope that helps out. Going to go into the endocrine, which is even more complex, and then into the nervous system. Hope to see you at the review that's coming up on the next Tuesday, where we'll look at the next FRQ because they've been helpful. Also, hopefully notice that we've had two targets today. One was primary and secondary immune response. Primary is that innate. You're born with it. Macrophages try to eat things. You have cell-mediated response where cytotoxic T cells kill off infected cells, all the swelling, all the fever. You do that every time you're infected, but you don't have to do it as much if you build those B cells. And those B cells have the memory cells and the antibodies so that you can clog it up before it actually causes the infection to mount. And that's what we all need in this COVID vacation, is the ability to have the antibodies without going through the possibility of dying during primary immunity.